there is a passage in the field notes of an Arctic explorer, written more than 100 years ago, that almost no one talks about today. He had spent the winter among Inuit families along a frozen coastline, learning their language, listening to the stories the elders told in the long dark. And again, from camps that were hundreds of miles apart, he heard the same account. Before our people came here, the elders said, this land already belonged to someone else. They were taller than us. They were stronger than us. They could lift stones that 4 of our men together could not move. And then, without a war, we remember they were gone. For a long time these accounts were treated as folklore, the kind of story people tell to explain the ruins scattered across a landscape, old stone houses no one living had built, rings of rock half sunk into the tundra, tools of a shape the Inuit did not make. But in the last few decades, something strange has happened. Scientists began to test the bones found in those ruins, and what the laboratories reported back-matched, almost word for word, what the elders had been saying for 1,000 years. So the question this leaves us with is a simple one, and it will not let go easily. Were the Inuit describing a myth, invented to explain the ruins around them, or were they remembering, across 100 generations, a real people who actually lived and actually vanished from the top of the world? To understand why this matters, you have to understand how the Inuit spoke about these beings, because they never spoke about them the way people speak about monsters or spirits. They spoke about them the way you might speak about a family that used to live in your valley before you were born. The Inuit had a name for them. They called them the Tuniit, and in some regions the Inuit, a word that means, quite plainly, the first inhabitants. Not gods, not giants out of a fairy tale. The first people. According to the tradition, the Tuniit were already here when the ancestors of today's Inuit arrived from the west, sweeping across the Arctic in a great migration many centuries ago. The Tuniit were described as physically powerful, broad and heavy, capable of astonishing feats of strength. The elders said a single Tuniit man could carry a full-grown walrus across his shoulders, or haul a slab of stone so large that it would take several Inuit working together to shift it. Their homes, the stories said, were built partly of these enormous stones, dug down into the earth and roofed with turf and bone. But strength was not what defined them in the memory of the Inuit. What defined them was their shyness. The Tuniit, the elders insisted, were a timid people. They avoided strangers, they startled easily and fled rather than fight. They kept to themselves along the coasts, hunting seal and walrus at the edge of the ice, and they wanted almost nothing to do with the newcomers. This was not the description of an enemy. It was the description of a neighbour who was slowly, quietly, being pushed out of the world. And that detail, that gentleness, is one of the reasons researchers have taken these stories so seriously. Myths tend to make the vanished people into villains or demons. The Inuit did the opposite. They remembered the Tuniit almost with tenderness as a people who had simply faded away. Before we go further, if you enjoy documentaries that explore forgotten history through records, archaeology, and indigenous tradition, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps me keep researching and telling stories like this one. For most of modern history, that is where the matter would have ended, with a beautiful oral tradition and nothing solid beneath it. But the Arctic, it turns out, keeps very good records of its own. Scattered across the far north of Canada, across Greenland, across the frozen islands that most maps barely bother to name, archaeologists kept finding the remains of a way of life that did not fit. It did not match the tools of the modern Inuit, and it did not match anything else in the Americas. The sites were old, some of them thousands of years old, and they were distinct in almost every detail. The people who left them carved beautiful, haunting little figures out of ivory and soapstone, tiny faces and animals of a style found nowhere else on earth. They built long communal structures out of stone and turf. They hunted with weapons unlike those of their neighbours, and here is the detail that stops you cold when you first read it. These people, whoever they were, seem to have had no bow and arrow. They appear to have had no dogs, and therefore no dog sleds. They had no drills. In the harshest environment on the planet, they survived for thousands of years without some of the very tools that everyone assumed were essential to Arctic life. Archaeologists gave this vanished culture a name, taken from the place in Canada where their remains were first carefully studied. They called them the Dorset, and when scientists worked out the timeline, it lined up with something remarkable. The Dorset had lived across the Arctic for something on the order of 2,000 years, a stable and ancient presence. And then, roughly 700 or 800 years ago, at almost exactly the time the ancestors of the modern Inuit came sweeping in from the west, the Dorset simply disappear from the record. Their sites go quiet, their strange, delicate carvings stop being made, an entire people gone. For a long time the disappearance was one of the quiet mysteries of northern archaeology, and the natural assumption was the obvious one. The Dorset must have been absorbed. Surely, when the newcomers arrived, the two peoples met, traded, intermarried, and the Dorset simply blended into the incoming population until they were no longer a separate people. It is a comfortable explanation, and for decades it was the expected answer. But the Inuit tradition said something different. The elders had never described a blending. They described a departure. The Tuniit, they said, did not join us. They left. They withdrew to the far edges of the land, and then they were no longer there. And the two versions of events, the scientific assumption and the oral tradition, quietly contradicted each other. One said the old people were absorbed into the new. The other said the old people vanished as a people, distinct to the very end. For most of the 20th century, there was simply no way to know which was true. You cannot ask bones who their grandchildren were, or at least you could not until the science caught up with the question. And when it finally did, the answer did not split the difference. It came down firmly and startlingly on the side of the elders. The turning point came when researchers were finally able to read something the old stories and the old bones had both been holding on to all along, the genetic record itself. In a major study, an international team of scientists gathered ancient remains and hair and bone from across the Arctic, spanning thousands of years, and they read the DNA locked inside them. They compared the genetic signature of the ancient Dorset and of the even older Arctic peoples before them against the DNA of the modern Inuit who live in the same lands today. If the comfortable theory were correct, if the Dorset had been absorbed, then their genetic fingerprint should still be there, mixed into the people of the north like an old bloodline that never fully disappears. That is not what the scientists found. They found that the ancient people of the Arctic, the population that included the Dorset, were genetically distinct. They had come into the region thousands of years earlier, and for all those millennia they had remained a separate people, isolated, marrying among themselves. A single long lineage stretched across the roof of the world. And then, around 700 years ago, that lineage came to an end. It did not flow into the modern Inuit. It stopped. The people who live in the Arctic today descend overwhelmingly from the later migration, the Thule, the ancestors the Inuit always said had arrived and found someone already here. The Dorset, the study concluded, had contributed almost nothing to the modern population. Genetically, they had not been absorbed at all. They had, in the coldest and most literal sense, vanished. Now sit for a moment with what that means, because it is easy to read past it. For over 1,000 years, with no written language, with no laboratories, with nothing but memory passed from an elder to a child, and from that child to the next, the Inuit had preserved a specific and testable claim about the deep past. They said a different people were here first. Science confirmed a different people were here first. They said those people were not their ancestors, but a separate group. The genetics confirmed a separate group. They said those people did not merge with them, but disappeared. The DNA confirmed that the lineage disappeared. Detail after detail, the oral tradition and the hard scientific record described the same event. The tradition said the Tuniit were strong and heavy, and the archaeology shows a people who hauled great stones and built with them. The tradition said the Tuniit kept to themselves and avoided contact, and the archaeology shows a culture that remained separate and unmixed for thousands of years. The tradition said they were shy and fled rather than fight, and the record shows no evidence of a great war, only a people who quietly ceased to be. None of this on its own proves that every element of the old stories is literally true. Memory is not a photograph, and 1,000 years is a long time for a story to travel. But it becomes very hard to argue that the Inuit simply invented the Tuniit to explain the ruins when the details they preserved keep turning out to match what the ruins and the bones inside them actually say. And that is where this story stops being only about the Arctic and starts being about something larger, about how we decide what counts as knowledge in the first place. For most of the last few centuries, the accounts of indigenous peoples about their own deep past were quietly set aside. They were labelled legend, folklore, myth, filed under stories rather than history, treated as charming but unreliable. The written record, the excavation, the laboratory, those were knowledge. The words of an elder in a snow house were something softer, something less. The story of the Tuniit is a direct challenge to that hierarchy. Here was a people with no writing at all, and yet across 1,000 years and 100 generations, they carried forward a true account of an ancient population that modern science would only rediscover with the most advanced tools available. The memory was not a decoration on top of the history. The memory was the history, preserved by other means. It makes you wonder how many other traditions, dismissed for generations as mere myth, are in fact careful records waiting for the science to catch up. The vanished people of the American Southwest, the great floods remembered on coastlines around the world, the strangers who came before, in story after story, from cultures that never met. We have been trained to hear the phrase the elders say, and to lower our expectations. The Tuniit suggest we should do the opposite. We may never recover the full truth of who the Tuniit really were. We do not know what their voices sounded like, or what they called themselves, or what they felt in the last generations as a new people spread across their ancient hunting grounds, and the world they knew grew quiet around them. Their carvings survive, those small haunting ivory faces staring out of museum cases, and now their genetic signature survives, read out of ancient bone. But the people themselves are gone in a way that is almost complete, a whole human lineage that walked the top of the world for thousands of years, and then ended. What survived them longest was not their tools or their houses, or even their bones. What survived longest was the memory that other people kept of them. The Inuit could have let the Tuniit be forgotten. Instead, for 1,000 years they told their children that this land had belonged to someone else first, someone strong and shy who vanished, and they were right. History is rarely settled by a single discovery, and this story is not truly closed. But it leaves us with a question worth carrying with you after this video ends. When an old tradition and a modern laboratory finally sit down beside each other and tell the same story, which one was really keeping the record all along? Thank you for watching. Before you go, I would genuinely like to hear your thoughts. Do you think the Inuit preserved a real factual memory of the Tuniit across 1,000 years? Or do you think the match between story and science is something else entirely? Let me know in the comments, and I will see you in the next documentary.